So the next topic I wanted to talk about was GÖDEL'S. I have no idea how to say his name, but the dude whose name starts with a last name starts with a G. I'm gonna talk about his incompleteness theorem. I'm gonna talk. Yeah, that's my plan to discuss for this particular video, and I've thought about this topic a lot, and I've never been sure if I wanted to necessarily cover it because I don't have a lot to say about the theorem in and of itself, other than how it represents some problems with modern mathematics. I don't know if I really understand what exactly he's trying to say because a lot of it is convoluted, rationalistic, just really, really abstract and essentially meaningless. He's just playing around with symbols a lot of the time, and that's essentially what the whole theorem is, just playing around with symbols quite a bit. So I've never been able to fully put my finger on what's wrong with it enough to actually debunk it, but I think having a discussion around the topic of it might be interesting because then I can sort of talk about more, I guess, general principles of mathematics, which is something I've wanted to get into for a while, especially since I've been reading this book. Hold on, let me get it out first for a second. Mathematics is About the World by Robert E. Knapp. He basically applies I'll read the subheading, How Ayn Rand's Theory of Concepts Unlocks the False Alternative Between Plato's Mathematical Universe and Hilbert's Game of Symbols. So I've wanted to talk about math for a while, and I think that this particular video discussing the incompleteness theorem will give me a good opportunity to discuss what's wrong with modern mathematics, the ways in which people think about math that is wrong, and basically try to give you guys a direction for how to properly think about mathematics. I couldn't do all of that in one video. This is like a 500-page book that I think hopefully justifies it fully. I'm about 100 pages in so far. But so far it's been really, really, really nice. It's been a really good book. Been really clarifying on a lot of mathematical principles. But my goal here, I guess, is to apply some of these ideas to the incompleteness theorem and generally use it as a springboard to discuss the modern mathematical scene as a whole. So let's switch over my screen really quickly and put in some headphones, actually. Let's switch over the screen first. And let me know if how the audio is working. Also, I'm going to be responding to a number file video here where they talk about this theorem. So you guys know how much I love number file, but whatever. We'll try to keep the ad hominems down and try to focus on the ideas.
I've been quite obsessed with Gödel's incompleteness theorem for many years because it kind of places this extraordinary limitation on what we might be able to know in mathematics. In fact, it's quite an unnerving theorem because at its heart it says there might be conjectures out there about numbers, for example, something like Goldbach's conjecture, which might actually be true. So it might be true that every even number is the sum of two primes, but maybe within the axiomatic system we have for mathematics, there isn't a proof of that. The real worry is...
Yeah, so that's one thing I wanted to talk about. He sort of gave me a interesting springboard here because he talks about how with the axiomatic system of mathematics, there isn't necessarily a proof for every single theorem in existence, for every single true theorem in existence, which I don't know if I fully reject that. I don't know if that's essentially the heart of the theorem, the idea that the axioms cannot prove every possible true mathematical statement, that there is no given set of axioms from which you can deduce every single true theorem. And I don't know if there's necessarily anything wrong with that. However, I think that the problem is this idea that you need to be able, trying to think how to properly phrase this. So I think the problem with a big problem with modern mathematics is this idea that that mathematics is basically choosing the set of arbitrary axioms and deducing everything from there. I think that's a massive problem with modern mathematics, and I think the incompleteness theorem is sort of a result of that idea when you apply it completely consistently. Because the idea that every single true statement can be proved from some set of axioms seems doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I guess the axioms need to be based off of perceptual data. The axioms need to be based off of things that you can perceive in reality. The base of everything is perception, not axioms. Axioms are abstract principles, and as such, since abstract principles don't exist in reality, they're simply refer to concrete perceptual things. It seems weird to say that you just deduce math from these arbitrary axioms that you just come up with out of thin air. That seems very backwards to me, because, or not necessarily backwards, it's just a problem with mathematics in its modern form. It's just very, very rationalistic, very, very not based on perceptual data. You need to start with perceptual data, form your axioms from there, and then from there you deduce mathematics. But the idea that everything in mathematics can be deduced from axioms doesn't seem to make sense. But let's look at the chat, possibly see what people are saying, because this particular concept is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'm not entirely clear on the implications of the incompleteness theorem. But I sort of wanted to use it as a springboard, as I already said, to discuss sort of the rationalism of modern mathematics and how there is a huge problem with trying to deduce all of mathematics from axioms, and viewing mathematics as simply a game where you move around symbols and try to deduce things from arbitrary axioms. This is sort of the premise that mathematics is about the world is trying to combat. It's basically trying to explain that no, mathematics is based on things that you perceive in reality. It's based on taking measurements in reality, taking ways to measure things in reality and compare quantitative relationships, and then coming up with this sort of open-ended principle that can apply to all those things. So let's think about I don't know. Let's start really simple. For example, with the concept of a line. Now, I think Euclid defines a line as this, as a like straight, as like pure length with no width, essentially. I'm not sure what the actual definition is. That's kind of just off the top of my head. But it's basically something that has no width. But every single thing in reality has some width. Every single line that you will ever perceive in reality has some width. However, when you think about this in terms of Ayn Rand's theory of concepts, you can essentially view the width as a measurement that you are omitting. It's irrelevant for the actual calculation. In this circumstance, for your particular context, the width of this line is completely meaningless. It means nothing, has no effect on your situation. So you can treat it as a line, and you can apply mathematical abstractions to that. But yeah, anyways, that's essentially the idea that that's how mathematics can be about the world when it refers to these abstract concepts. However, people don't really understand that mathematics is sort of an abstraction from concretes that can refer to concretes by omitting irrelevant measurements. And because of that, they disconnect it entirely from reality, because because they think that there's no particular line in reality that has absolutely no width. So how can you apply these theories about lines that have no width to lines that have width? Well, as I explained, it's because the width is an omitted measurement that you can basically drop. But they never really fully understand that because they didn't have Rand's theory of concepts. A lot of them, most of them would reject Rand's theory of concepts. So then they decide, okay, we're going to have these arbitrary axioms that we deduce everything from there. Yeah. Oh, Kirk Wilcox mentioned earlier. What's up, Kirk? How you doing? He mentioned that Harry Binswanger is working on a book about math. That's something that I'm actually really excited for. I think James Elias mentioned that to me, and I'm really excited to read about that. That would be another book that I can add to the collection. Oh, Diego actually brings up a really good point, I think, in the chat. Because if mathematical axioms are based on reality, then what are you deducing? Then what are you deducing mathematical truths from, if not from these axioms? A mystical potato? That's true. You need to, your axioms obviously need to be based on reality, and that and another thing I was thinking about. I think let's get into the video a little bit more, because we're only 34 seconds in. I've gone on a whole tangent discussing what math is, and yeah.
So what if there's a true statement that I'm working away on which actually doesn't have a proof? Now this was a big kind of revelation for mathematics, because I think ever since the ancient Greeks we believed that any true statement about mathematics will have a proof. We might be quite difficult to find, like Fermat's last theorem took 350 years before my colleague in Oxford, Andrew Wiles, found the proof. But I think we all have this kind of feeling like, well, surely every true statement has a proof. But
sure. So I'm trying. Let me think of what I'm going to look up Rand's definition of proof real quick. Proof Rand definition. Just so I'm being. Oh shoot. Proof. Here we go. I think I have an idea what it means, but I want to be very. Proof in the full sense is a process of deriving a conclusion step by step from the evidence of the senses, each step being taken in accordance with the laws of logic. Now notice here a distinction that they're already making, or it's not really, that they're already conflating deducing something from the axioms with proving it. I think that's an essential difference. Deducing something from the axioms means that you have come up with a set of axioms and you're deducing it from there. However, proof is different from deduction from axioms. Proof is a process of connecting ideas, connecting something down to a reality, down to some some truth that you already know to be the case. So I think there's already some sort of difference there, because there's all sorts of different ways to prove things, rather than apart from just reducing them down to the axioms. You need basically what proof consists of is tying the principle to reality in some way. So it seems like they're already making that distinction there, because there is a difference between deducing from the axioms and tying something to reality. These people, these rationalists, essentially, that's what they are. They substitute reality for the axioms, for arbitrary axioms. They say, okay, we have these arbitrary axioms that seem like they make sense, that seem like they consist with reality, and now we'll deduce from there. We'll get down to these axioms, when really what they should be doing is trying to get down to reality. So let us move on.
But Gödel showed that actually there's a gap between truth and proof. I wrote it down here because it's quite cute. So it's one of these cards. The statement on the other side of this card is false. So let's suppose that's true. So it means that the statement on the other side of the card is false. So we turn it over, and then it says the statement on the other side of this card is true. Well, that's meant to be false. So it means the one on the other side is also false. But we suppose that was true. So that's false. So the other side is true, which means that, and you get into this kind of.
So this is just a straight up contradiction. This just doesn't, this is essentially a meaningless statement. What he's saying here, that this combination of statements is essentially meaningless. It has absolutely no tie to reality. So there's no real way to say true or false here. It just doesn't make sense. It's completely arbitrary. It's just a combination of words that means absolutely nothing.
Infinite loop. Verbal paradoxes are fine because you don't expect every sort of verbal sentence to have a truth value to it. But then when I went up to university, I realized that mathematics, you can't have those. Yet when I took this course on mathematical logic and we learned about Gödel's Incompleteness Theorem, he'd use this kind of self-referential statement to really undermine our belief that all true statements could be proved.
Well, that's not really a true statement. It's just the self-referential statement was just completely meaningless and arbitrary. It's not a true statement that can't be proved there. You can't like prove a negative. That's not something that you can do, because like proof consists of tying something back to reality. Well, how do you tie something that doesn't exist back to reality? It doesn't like the thing that doesn't exist doesn't have an effect on reality. So like I think Peikoff would always talks about gremlins. The non-existence of gremlins has no tangible impact on reality. Now, if gremlins did exist, it would have an impact on reality. And as all things are connected, it would have an impact on basically everything in reality to some extent, to some very, very minor extent with certain things. But yeah, let's read what XU wrote. Gödel, is it Gödel? I don't know how to say his name. Gödel can be assumed to be 100% true, but what he's just saying is that given a mathematical set of axioms, you cannot prove, for instance, the axioms of the unit. But how do you prove 1 using 1? The axiom of the unit, 1 plus 1 equals 2, but how do you prove 1 using 1? Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Obviously, you can't prove... But that's sort of the argument that you obviously can't prove the axioms using the axioms. That makes no sense. So this is why you need reality. You need perception as the base, because when you just deduce things from axioms, the axioms become completely arbitrary. And then, actually, one instance of this not connected to math is when Destiny had this debate with Darth Dawkins, and since Destiny believes that all axioms are arbitrary, he found it really difficult when Darth Dawkins was discussing, like, how does he know anything? How does he know anything's true? And Destiny, like, went down to his axioms, and he was like, okay, how do you know those are true? Well, then he was like, well, they're completely arbitrary. And then Darth Dawkins was like, well, why can't I just have God as my arbitrary axiom? And then there was no real answer for it. Destiny didn't really have much of an answer.
It was a feeling like we should be able to prove that mathematics is something called consistent, that mathematics won't give rise to contradictions. This had been kind of inspired by certain kind of little paradoxes that people like Bertrand Russell had come up with. People might have come across this idea of the set of all sets that don't contain themselves as members, and then the challenge is, well, is that set in this set or not? Actually, a really nice kind of sort of version of this is another sort of mathematical kind of verbal paradox.
Yeah, I think Bertrand Russell is the one who is responsible for a lot of the rationalism in mathematics. Just from what I've seen of him, I don't have a full like understanding of Bertrand Russell's philosophy, but his idea that like all of math can be proved from the sets, all of math can be proved from set theory. I think that's generally his idea, but he seems like he's essentially the one responsible for this idea that all of math consists of taking arbitrary axioms and deducing everything from there, at least from my understanding of mathematical philosophy, which, to be honest, doesn't span much from beyond applying Rand's theory of concepts to it, and some obviously experiences that I've had in college with like learning math and learning about like set theory and those sort of things, and my general understanding through like Wikipedia of like different things about Bertrand Russell.
Paradox is all those numbers that can be defined in less than 20 words. So, for example, 1729, which is the taxi cab number that Ramanujan and Hardy talked about, you can define that in less than 20 words. It's the smallest number, which is the sum of two cubes in two different ways. So that's less than 20 words. So then you define the following number, the smallest number which cannot be defined in less than 20 words. Now, I think if you count that up, I've just defined that number in less than 20 words. And you go, well, that's a bit worrying, because surely that is a sort of kind of number we might define, the smallest number which has a certain property. So there was a real feeling that these paradoxes, these set theoretic paradoxes, were beginning to be a real challenge to mathematics at the turn of the 20th century. And David Hilbert, one of his...
hey, David Hilbert is on the title of this book, Challenging Hilbert's Game of Symbols. Perfect. I love how David Hilbert, who is talked about by Knapp throughout his book, is mentioned in this video, because Hilbert is sort of, I guess, Hilbert must be the one who he credits with rationalism in mathematics. So maybe it's not right to credit Bertrand Russell with that. Bertrand Russell is just the more famous one, I think. But yeah, sort of the idea that that mathematics is derived from arbitrary axioms.
Sort of big problems that he challenged mathematics with in the 20th century, these 23 big unsolved problems. The second one was to prove that mathematics was in fact consistent. And included in that was that every true statement should be provable. But what a shock he got, actually. 30 years later, along comes this Austrian logician, Kurt Gödel, who blows this idea that we can prove maths is consistent out of the water and shows there are true statements which can't be proved within any mathematical system.
What does that have to do with consistency, though? That, from my understanding of consistency, doesn't that just mean things don't contradict? I mean, that's the basic definition. Maybe there's a different mathematical definition I'm not getting at here, because I've never taken like a mathematical logic class.
How does mathematics work? We set down things we call axioms, which are the kind of things we believe are the way numbers, geometry work. So, for example, if I take 6 and I add 7 to that, I don't think it's going to be different from taking 7 and adding 6 to that. That seems so blindingly obvious, and that's one of the axioms of the way numbers work. You know, maybe somewhere out there.
Yeah, but that's also not like an arbitrary axiom. That's something that you directly perceive. You see that when you have 6 things, when you have 6 objects and add 7 objects to them, then you get the same as when you take 7 objects and add 6 objects to them. Did I say that right? I hope I said that right. But you guys hopefully get what I mean there.
That goes wrong, but I don't really care. I'm interested in a mathematics where that is true of all numbers, and I have rules which allow me to make deductions from those axioms. And that's how mathematics works. Each time we make these logical deductions, we expand the conclusions from these axioms. We can add new axioms if we feel like, you know what, we haven't actually captured the whole of mathematics. And that was somehow the mission was we want to have a set of axioms which are strong enough and that we believe are basic about numbers, from which we can deduce all true statements, that we will have a proof. And so there was a feeling like, well, maybe we haven't got all of the axioms, and if we've got a true statement which can't be proved, we could add that as a new axiom, and it will expand what we can prove within mathematics. So this is very important for Gödel, because we are trying to prove that there will be a set of axioms from which we can deduce all truths of mathematics.
See, this is the error. I think that's the fundamental error there. But I've discussed that quite a bit already.
Gödel did something very clever, because he cooked up a way of allowing mathematics to talk about itself. So what he produced was this thing we now call the Gödel coding. So he showed that any statement about numbers has its own particular code number. He in fact used prime numbers in order to make this coding. So every statement about mathematics could be turned into a number. So for example, the axioms of mathematics from...
See, look, this also seems completely arbitrary. Like, how does he convert this into a number? I guess I'd have to look at his particular paper, but like, this seems completely arbitrary. Just saying, oh, let's convert all the statements into a number, and then let's keep going. Let's listen to this theorem.
Which we are trying to make all of our deductions. They would have code numbers. True statements about mathematics. So, for example, Fermat's last theorem, for example, will have a code number. Also, false statements like 17 is an even number will have a code number.
Professor, what do these code numbers look like? They're obviously whoppers.
They're absolutely huge, but it's a unique coding. So every code number can be worked backwards into a statement. Not every number will have a meaningful mathematical statement, but it's more interesting the other way. Every mathematical statement will have a unique number associated with it.
So he's just creating this like whole set of real numbers that just contains all completely arbitrary mathematical statements, one that makes sense, ones that oh my god.
Like how most things
the rationalism on this is very, very clear and obvious, I think, but because none of what about mathematical statements implies that what about a statement about mathematics connects it to a specific number? Like, what in reality demonstrates that? What about
It has zeros and ones and things.
Very good. So if I'm typing away and I write the...
So how do you determine whether a certain statement gets a number or whether it doesn't, because you can essentially come up with like an infinite number of mathematical statements and then like another infinity as well as that. Like it's so largely absurd. And yeah, like there's an uncountably infinite number of mathematical statements that you could produce essentially, but he's assigning them each an individual whole number. But yeah, because like from every single statement that you make, you can produce an infinite variety of those statements using like the infinite number of concretes in reality, and near infinite number of combinations of those concretes in reality. So like 1 + 1 = 2, that's a mathematical statement. One book plus one book equals 2 books, that's a mathematical statement. And then you just have all these different directions that you can go off of that. Plus all the possible every single possible false statement as well. Like you can just come up with absolutely nonsensical gibberish. You can, and that's assigned to number 2. That's a mathematical statement. That like this makes no sense. What connection does this have to reality?
Name Gödel, that will be changed into ASCII code. It will have a number associated with it. So Gödel cooked this up, but why is that useful? Because you can now actually talk about proof in mathematics using these numbers. So you can start to talk about mathematics using mathematics. So for example, you might want to know, well, is this particular statement provable from the axioms? That, I'm going to completely simplify this, but it'll give you a feel for it. Essentially, it's a bit like saying any statement whose code number is divisible by the code number of the axioms will be provable from the axioms. That's an incredible simplification, but it's good because it means now we can talk about...
Okay, so why does that work? Why are the primes like assigned a specific or I guess why are the axioms given this specific number and why is like a multiple of them? I guess he's not really going too much in depth, so I don't know if I can fully look at all this stuff and fully attack and debunk everything he's saying, because a lot of this is very, very surface level. But yeah, anyways.
Proof within mathematically. To say that something is provable is to say, for example, that its code number must be divisible by the axioms. So now Gödel challenges you with the following statement. This statement cannot be proved from the axioms that we have for our system of mathematics. So this is actually something that has a code number. We can talk about proof using numbers. So this will be a statement that can be changed into a mathematical equation. Now this means because it's an equation in mathematics, it's either true or it's false. Let's start by saying that the statement is false. That means that this statement is provable from the axioms is true. But a provable statement must be true. So now we've started with something which we assumed was false, and now we've deduced that it's true. So we've got a contradiction. And we're assuming that mathematics is consistent, so we can't have contradictions. This is important. So that means it can't be false. This means it must be true.
Sure. So since mathematics is based on reality, based on your perceptions, your axioms come from perception, since all that is true, and since reality is non-contradictory, A is A, everything is what it is, and yeah, you observe that in reality from your first observation. Mathematics is definitely consistent. However, consistent, or there's no contradictions in mathematics. However, the idea that everything can be proved from the axioms, from arbitrarily chose axioms, I would agree that is not true, and I think his incompleteness theorem would make sense as so far as it does that. Trying to go in and debunk his theorem, I tried to do that a little bit, but this video in particular doesn't provide enough information for me to fully grasp and argue against what exactly he does in his theorem. So I would need to look more in depth into that. And I admit I do not fully understand this theorem. So any sort of speculations by me about what might be a hole in this theorem is not necessarily my place to do that. I'm not a mathematical expert yet, and I'm not a philosophical expert as well. But yeah, I think if you take proof to be deducing from the axioms, deducing from a set of arbitrary axioms, I would argue that that's probably true, or that it's probably true that you can't prove every single possible true statement from the axioms. However, I do think that it is possible to prove every single true statement by tying it back to reality, which is what I would say is the proper form of proof. If you have some way of tying it back to reality, then it's provable. Now, you might not be able to prove it with specific axioms within a system built on arbitrarily chosen axioms. However, there is a way to connect every single statement back to reality as such, because every single thing that is true has some impact on reality, which I don't know if I can fully justify that here. You would need to almost essentially do inductively see that for yourself in reality.
True, because a mathematical statement is either true or false. It's not like these linguistic paradoxes which just don't have a truth value. If it's an equation of mathematics, it's either true or it's false. We've just shown if it's false that leads to a contradiction. This means that this statement must be true. Ah, great, we've got a true statement, but let's now reinterpret what it says. It says this statement cannot be proved from the axioms. We have...
Oh no, Anarchy sees. I disagree with that. Reality just means axioms. I would disagree with that claim. I think axioms need to be based on reality. If you're going to, yeah, I don't think. I guess in the sense that like existence is an axiom, the fact that existence exists is an axiom. Yeah, actually maybe if you view the axioms as something that just is reality, that your perceptions are your axioms, then I guess in that sense, that's true. But I think I view axioms more as like an abstract principle. I don't know. I don't want to say anything irresponsible here, where I'm like trying to say something that I don't actually have a fully formed opinion on. But because I haven't thought about that too much, whether or not like, oh, reality is just the axioms. But I think axioms are abstract principles formed from perception, from a given number of concretes. So like the idea that existence exists, or I guess an easier one to talk about would be the argument that A is A. You see each individual concrete instance of a thing acting according to its own nature, of a thing being itself, and then you can form that principle, that initial axiom that A is A, everything is what it is.
We've now got a true statement which cannot be proved true from the axioms of mathematics. And that's exactly what Gödel wanted. He's now got a statement of mathematics which is true but cannot be proved. And you go, well, hold on, how do we actually prove that was true? We just proved it's true. And it's very important to articulate. What we have done is, within a system of mathematics with certain axioms, we've found a true statement within there which can't be proved true within that system. We've proved it's true by working outside the system and looking in, because we could now add that as an axiom.
Oh, great. Wait. No, that's perfect. I agree with that. From looking outside the system, and that would be from reality, from tying it to reality rather than just tying it directly to those axioms. So yeah, I would definitely agree with that. This statement cannot be proved from the axioms. Sure, so that actually brings up an interesting point. I don't know if I fully disagree with this anymore, because the idea that you can prove something, because he's arguing that you can prove that true from outside the system. Well, reality, in a sense, is outside of the mathematical system. It's what the mathematical system is based upon. And if his incompleteness theorem essentially creates axioms that you can reduce individual mathematical statements down to, and then those axioms are in turn connected to reality, well then there might be some true statements outside of that you can't prove from those particular axioms, but you can still tie them to reality in some way. So yeah.
It's a true statement, so it won't make something which is consistent inconsistent. So we could add that as an axiom, and you say, well, now we've got a proof because it's just an axiom. It's one of these kind of infinite regresses. Gödel says, that's not going to help you because I can still cook up within this new system another statement which is true but unprovable. So it's a sort of infinite regress thing that it says that no matter how much you expand mathematics, adding axioms, they will always be missing something. A little bit.
This is almost an argument against rationalism as a means to proving. He's using really, really rationalistic means to get there, but he's essentially saying that no, you can't figure out everything that's true just from deriving from the axioms. You have to instead tie certain things to something apart from the axioms, which would be reality, which is where the axioms themselves are derived from. He's saying there's an infinite number of things that you cannot derive from the axioms. Or there's an infinite number of axioms that are necessary to deduce all true statements from.
Like, if you remember the proof that there are infinitely many primes, you say, suppose there are finitely many primes, then you prove that there's some primes missing from that list. And you say, well, I'll add those, and Euclid just keeps playing the same trick. Well, that's still not good enough, because there are still some things missing. Gödel has a similar kind of feel to it, that you might try and expand your mathematics to add that as an axiom, but that won't help because he can keep on playing the same game.
It feels like, though, this problem is just restricted to this little self-referential corner. Like, it doesn't feel like this puts Goldbach out of reach and other things out of reach. It's just this one little game you can play with referencing to itself.
This was mathematicians' hope that, okay, there's some weird logical Gödelian sentences which who really cares about because they don't really have much mathematical content. And I think people just hoped that things like Goldbach would not be one of these. But that hope was really blown away. In 1977, mathematicians came up with some statements about numbers that you think of a kind of like Goldbach nature, that you think, well, yeah, that's something I'd want to be able to prove is true. And they showed that these were sentences which were true but not provable within quite a standard system for mathematics.
See, that's interesting though, but they still were able to prove that they were true somehow. So how did they do that? Even if you're not connecting it to the specific axioms of mathematics, you're still connecting it to reality. You're still proving that it's true. So essentially here they're bringing up a distinction between proof and deduction from the axioms again. I think that's an important distinction to make here, because deducing from the axioms is not the same as proof. Proof means tying it to reality. So if you deduce something from the axioms, or from a set of axioms, you haven't fully proved it. You have to prove that that axiom that you're deducing it from is true. And that means you have to tie that to reality in some way. So essentially, reality, perception, all that's the base. That's where everything must stem from.
So we've now discovered that we can't hope that it's just weird self-referential Gödelian sentences that are going to be knocked out. It could be Goldbach. Twin primes might also be something like that. Gödel even talked about the Riemann hypothesis. We might be having trouble proving it, but just because we haven't expanded the axioms of mathematics to such a level that it is provable. Now, there are some sentences like Riemann which are intriguing, because if Riemann turns out to be a mathematical statement which doesn't have a proof, if we could prove that it doesn't have a proof, weirdly, this would prove that the Riemann hypothesis must be true. Now you go, oh, no. Why? Because if the Riemann hypothesis is false, this means that there's a zero off the line. This means there's actually a constructive way to find that. You can set a computer off, and eventually, after a finite process, if it's false, it will find the reason why it's false. So if it's false, it must be provably false. So if we find that Riemann is actually undecidable, cannot be proved from the axioms of mathematics, there's no way it can be false, because that will be provable. So it must be true. So this is a really weird way that you might prove Riemann hypothesis, is to prove that it's actually an undecidable statement.
That's interesting, because there's a sense in which the Riemann hypothesis is like saying this particular thing doesn't exist. Like there is no solution off of that line, or no solution between the 0 and 1 that is off of that line. I'm not being really clear here, but that's because it's kind of a side point. I don't know if I want to explain the whole Riemann hypothesis. That's an interesting point, though.
Within the axioms of mathematics.
If you're watching this video thinking you've got even more questions about Gödel incompleteness, don't worry, so did I, and there's a whole lot of extra interview footage. Click the links on the screen or in the video description. Also,
I think when I first heard about this theorem, I was really, really confused. So I watched the second video, and I was still pretty confused afterward. I think his incompleteness theorem in and of itself is just a very, very confusing thing. But I think especially at the end of that video, when I made that connection, that like when they made that connection that there's still a way of proving these things, but not from the axioms. I think that's a very clarifying point, because it sort of proves that idea that you can't deduce everything from the axioms. So the incompleteness theorem is almost like it's weirdly a rationalistic way of debunking rationalism, which is really interesting, because he's sort of proving that, oh, there's a limit to my own way of approaching mathematics, to my own philosophical method. So yeah, I think once I heard him say, where was it, where he's like, oh, this thing was still true, but it was proven outside of the system of mathematics. Once I heard him say that, I think the whole system, or the whole idea, became a lot clearer to me of what this theorem is, and I guess its importance, and how to properly think about it from a more rational framework, where you're thinking about it in terms of mathematics being about the world and being something that is derived from reality rather than deduced from axioms, or proven from reality rather than deduced from axioms, because fundamentally everything in mathematics has to relate back to reality. It has to tie back in reality to some way, or everything that is true must do that, and that's what proof consists of, as from a Randian perspective, So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on that particular topic. Yeah, Existence University had one. Oh, he has a lot of last statements, so let's let them get in the video. Gödel's incompleteness theorem suggests that there may be other statements in number theory that provide more than a basic minimum of axioms to prove. Yet it doesn't tell you which statements those are, and what other axioms you need in order to prove them. Yeah, I mean that definitely strikes me as true. It just says that, okay, you might need to come up with other axioms here. You might need some other way of connecting it back to reality, other than this particular way that we've come up with as a mathematical community, our particular system of mathematics. You might need to do it through some other method besides that. But it doesn't really say, okay, what method do you use? Well, it can't really say that. So yeah, I think that's all that I have to say for this particular section of the video. And I'll upload this as a clip afterward. I feel like the beginning was a little bit unclear, but I think over time it sort of became more clear to me, the meaning of this theorem, and hopefully to you as well. Hopefully this is a learning process. That's sort of what this channel is. That's sort of what this channel is. My learning process, my growth process. I'm no expert, and I hope to learn more about the world with all of you. I love you all, and let's move on in the stream.